Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to It Says What, where JW3 and Limmud come together to bring you unexpected and poignant Jewish content every week before Shabbat. I am Joe Hyman, JW3's young programmer, and JW3, if you haven't met us, we are the UK's Jewish Community and Art Centre. We are partnering to bring you this content with Limmud, a diverse and inclusive worldwide community of Jewish learning. If you haven't come to JW3 yet, we are open, physically open and virtually open. Please join us for a program either in person, in the cinema, or various other things going on in the building, or join an online program like It Says What, and we'd really love to have you. Also, if you haven't seen, last night JW3 had its big night in. We raised over £300,000 to keep our building open and keep it going. Please have a watch online. It's a star-studded lineup from Jason Isaacs to Imelda Staunton to Mark Ronson. Plenty of celebrity, plenty of fun. Have a watch online on YouTube or Facebook. So this series will ask educators, artists, and leaders from across the Jewish community and abroad to share a surprising piece of Jewish wisdom for our time. You can ask your own questions in the comment feed on Facebook or YouTube in the webinar, and we're really excited to hear them and have them in the conversation later. So today we have Avram Mlotek, a rabbi, cantor, writer, and actor. In 2015, he co-founded Beis Hillel, a new model for Jewish practice that reaches out to unaffiliated young adults, now operating in 9 cities, and works as rabbi for its Manhattan location. He also serves as director of spiritual life for the international base program, as well as rabbi in residence at the Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. I used to go to the gym there when I was living in New York, actually. It's a great place. In May 2016, Mlotek was listed as one of America's most inspiring rabbis by The Forward. A grandchild of Holocaust refugees and native Yiddish speaker, his most recent book, Why Jews Do That, or 30 Questions Your Rabbi Never Answered, has just been released. We're really excited to have you, Avram. Welcome. How are you?
Pleasure to be here. Good morning. Good afternoon, rather.
Yes, thank you so much for waking up so early to join us today. So tell us, what has made you say It Says What?
So, first of all, I love the nature of this series, and it speaks to the ethos of this book that I've written, of engaging with questions and the centrality of questions and cultivating a curiosity around learning. But this text, before I share this text, I'd like to just back up for a moment. You know, I tease my parents often that I grew up confused-adox, because I grew up speaking Yiddish in the home, but not because I came from a Haredi or Hasidic background. My father runs the Yiddish theater in New York, but my mom came from a more modern Orthodox background. So while we had Shabbat and Kashrut growing up, communally we were all over the map. We went to, at one point I went to a Chabad Cheder, but also to conservative camp and modern Orthodox synagogues. And as a child, it was rather dissonant and confusing. Now I've come to cherish all those experiences because they've informed my understanding of the plurality of Judaism, but also the oneness of the Jewish people. Quick story, and then we'll jump right in, which is, I remember marching with my yeshiva for the Salute to Israel parade, which is a big parade down Fifth Avenue in New York City. And over on the side, along with the Neturei Karta, who are an extreme sect from the Satmar community who were protesting, I recognized some of those family friends that I knew from the Yiddish cultural community because of my father's world. Would grow up going to these Yiddish klezmer festivals and would meet queer Jews and Jews of color and Jews who were highly critical of Israel. And I must have been 7 or 8 years old at the time. And so as a kid, I remember waving and saying hello, to which my Rebbe, the chaperone, said, "You don't know them." But I said, "No, but I do know them." And so therein has rested so much of my own, confused-adox upbringing, feeling not quite at home in any one Jewish community, but still feeling Kol Yisrael Arevin Ze Leze, that we share a common fate, and our fates are intertwined. And And so this is why I love this text so much, because it pushes us as to the I guess the type of complete certainty in which we like approach our own views and our own ways. And maybe we'll just dive right in. Is that all right? Pesikta de Rav Kahana. So the Pesikta de Rav Kahana, by the way, is a collection of midrashim. One appeared to Israel at Sinai as though he were a statue with faces on every side. 1,000 people might be looking at the statue, but it would appear to each to be looking directly at him. So too, when the Holy One spoke, each and every person in Israel could say, the divine word is addressing me. The divine word spoke to each and every person according to his or her particular capacity. So what this text is so subversive for a number of different reasons. First, what I'd like to just highlight is, of all the metaphors that Chazal, that the rabbis might have opted and chosen to use to describe God, they choose a statue, they choose an idol, lest we forgot that, like, the Ten Commandments and just how much the rabbis disdain idol worship. But that's the metaphor that we use. And here it's a rather it seems to be a rather liberal and pluralistic understanding of truth, as if every person might say the divine word is addressing me and me alone. And so when you think about how we form a society and how law governs society, it can feel rather intimidating or scary, because if the law is saying one thing to me but it's saying another thing to someone else, well, how are we to get by? But we have to take a step back and understand that the Torah, in addition to being the law, relates to the concept of ha'ara, of awareness, of learning, and a deeper type of soul learning, which is the concept that the mystics teach, specifically the Chernobyl Rebbe, the Moranayim, who highlights the idea of this soul learning that relates to the Torah. So this is why I've chosen this text today, because we live in a time of more increased polarization, politically, religiously, and otherwise. I think depending where we are in our own echo chambers, we can be more and more convinced of our own sense of being right, religiously right, politically right, whatever it might mean. And yet here we have this midrash, this piece of Torah that is pushing us not necessarily to reevaluate our own sense of what's true and understanding, but to make space for someone else's. And that can be a challenging task. So I think I'll pause there and invite questions, comments, curiosities, and the like.
Thank you so much for sharing this text, and also sharing from yourself. I think it's really wonderful to hear about your kind of confused docs background. And I think it highlights how important It Says What is. If you've grown up in a denominational echo chamber, there'll be lots of texts that make you say It Says What, because people won't have been taught particular things, or things would have been kind of pushed to the side in some way. And it is surprising to see a text like this when maybe you've been presented your whole life a sense of, this is the Torah, this is the way it looks like, this is the one perspective that we're gonna take on, and the kind of the argument that there's a tradition that we carry through, and it's a single tradition. We pick the right opinion that we want to kind of continue with, and we take it through. And it's really fascinating seeing this text presenting something that's different, that asks us to hear someone else's kind of perspective on what that faith looks like. But for that traditionalist, for that someone who's watching today and saying, I grew up in this world which was, very orthodox or very traditional, that said there is this one clear line from Sinai until now, with one perspective. what would you say to them in terms of this? How do we take this text in a way that's about respect and not about necessarily kind of moral relativism?
It can be a challenging task, but we needn't look farther than this week's Torah portion to get a reminder of the importance of this type of idea. In Nitzavim Vayelech, right, we're still in Moses' epic goodbye speech to Bnei Israel, to the ancient Israelites, and he reminds them, Lo b'shamayim, right, it's not in heaven's hands, this covenant that God has set out before us for us to engage in. And the Torah itself, Lo b'shamayim, we know that the rabbis say the halacha, the law, is not necessarily in heaven's hands, but it's ours to learn and to cultivate, right? And I think the elsewhere in the Torah portion we learn this idea of, right, that it's not distant from us, but it's karov, it's close. And again, the mystical teachers encourage us, right? Again, the Chernobler, in fact, the Me'oranayim says, in order for it to be Torah, it has to be close. It has to be penetrative into our soul. So I agree with you that it would be that it offers a different type of module or thinking into what the law is, but it's a more it's an expansive it's an expansive term, and I think it only means the law, right? It's talking about a different type of learning experience. I also think that our tradition doesn't shy away from dissonance by any means, right? The entire Talmud records opinions that don't get ratified and codified into law, for Pete's sake, right? We famously say, right, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, that these and these are the words of the living God. It's living that can be much more challenging. So I actually think our tradition doesn't have a point A and to such a clear line from Sinai till now, and I think the tradition is comfortable with that diversity of thought. It's us, I think, who have a more challenging time as we try to govern our lives with a set of rules and rituals and the like, that have a harder time internalizing that type of dissonant thinking.
Thank you. Yeah, completely, and I completely see that multiplicity throughout the tradition, and I think that it's so important to kind of highlight that and raise that as difficult to transition from that place in text to practice. You mentioned the statue and how it's kind of like, it's quite funny that it's a idol worship. It's a statue that normally would be quite controversial to hear about in the context of worshiping God. From my perspective, I love this, because it's sort of like you expect a statue to have one face, but this one has multiple faces, and it doesn't become about that statue anymore. It becomes about the multiple faces on it now. And it's sort of saying, a statue with one face, that's Avodah Zarah, but one with multiple faces on that everyone can see a different side, that's really beautiful. So that's what I get from it. But I'd love to know, is there something else that you get from that statue reference in this text?
I mean, when I see, for me, the notion of a statue in general is just like an alarm for all of Chazal's diversity of opinions and just emotional intensity around Avodah Zarah, around idol worship, right? The rabbis famously say that right, one who dwells in anger is as if one who, right, is like one who commits idol worship. Right, elsewhere we said the rabbis say, Kol hamerachem al habriot, anyone who exhibits loving kindness upon their fellow creature is a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is a Jew, and anyone who doesn't, we would know, is not, right? Or we have enough to question their Yiddishkeit, their Judaism. So the whole concept of idol worship itself is so alive for me and for Chazal, that so when they use it here in the context of trying to invite us into a personal relationship with God or with the Torah, it sets off all these different associations, right? From Avram Avinu to Matan Torah, to the giving of the Torah, and I cherish that because, again, when we think about religious fundamentalism, it's almost subversively reminding us that the Torah too can become an idol, right? The Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, can become an idol. But Jews don't worship the Torah. Jews don't worship the Shulchan Aruch. Jews worship God, the one true God. And this is a wonderful reminder of that.
100%. I think that's really, really vital to hear. I'm really interested to hear, and I guess this is a continuation of this line of thought.
Yeah.
But the 70 faces of the Torah argument, which is similar to this,
right? Sure.
I keep on hearing when I mention the 70 faces of the Torah argument to people, there are 70 different faces and there are all these different perspectives. In particular spaces, that there's limits to that. There's limits to this religious experience. There's limits to this text. And I guess I wondered what do you see limits to this kind of experience, or does this allow for multiple and a huge variety of different experiences here, or is there something that is common amongst the people? Do they have a common experience as well as this multiple?
Right. It's 70. It's Shivim Panim. It's not 71. People often say, right?
Yeah.
I don't have a definitive answer to that. Instead, I rather err on the side of inclusion and inviting more voices, because in the same way we say Barov Am Hadrat Melech, or Ein Melech Below Am, right? That God's presence is magnified is beautified with the abundance of people, and that a king is only a king with a people. We need people. We need the voices. We need the multiplicity of voices in the room. I think of the famous Torah of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who says, yes, there's Arba Banim, right? There's 4 sons, there's 4 children to the Passover night. But there's actually a 5th child, right? And that's the 5th child who doesn't show up because they feel so isolated or, just disconnected from Jewish life and practice. It's a teaching that I think a lot about in the context of my work at Base, where we invite young folks in their 20s and 30s who are not necessarily rushing to join synagogues and communities and joining communal life in the way that their parents or grandparents' generation might have, but are still seeking learning and community and an authentic Jewish connection, but on their own terms. And so I prefer to err on that side of inclusion. Jews shouldn't be scared of ideas. That's not to say that there aren't pieces that are out of bounds with Jewish life and practice, but the Jewish people have always had a diversity of identity among us, from Bnei, from the Shvatim, from the tribes of Jacob, to the Pharisees and Sadducees and the like. I think about my great grandfather, who was a Melamed. He was a Judaic studies teacher in a shtetl outside of Warsaw. Um, he taught Limmudei Kodesh, but he also taught mathematics and astronomy. And his wife oversaw the family sewing business, and their children were Zionists and socialists and communists and Bundists. And I try to imagine what the discourse around the Shabbat table must have sounded like. Of course, that world was decimated in so many ways, but for me, that's what inspires me when I think about Jewish life. I want to hear those voices. I think the Torah is more magnified and glorified when we can have those abundance and diversity of voices contributing to the discourse.
I completely agree, and I think that fifth child, that image is so powerful and kind of makes me quite emotional, and thinking about that missing voice and bringing that extra voice in is so vital. And it sounds like, base is a place that actually happens. I'd love to hear how this text influenced the book that you created. How the idea of taking kind of these 1,000 different faces, or however many there are, and how do you take that and incorporate it into a book with questions and answers? It must have been so difficult to hold that multiplicity in that, but I'd love to hear how you went about doing that.
Sure. I think that the book was really a pleasure to work on, because I was working with my students, actually from Base Hillel. Favi Rodriguez and Jenny Young are both students of mine from the Base community, and they're the ones who contributed and provided the illustrations and cartoons, which in my opinion make the book all the more appealing. But the book is a playful introduction to Judaism, called Why Jews Do That, or 30 Questions Your Rabbi Never Answered. And it takes 30 questions and offers responses. I think that often I remember learning in yeshiva, and I remember I would have colleagues, friends, who would feel so frustrated by the idea of when people would say, well, Judaism says. Because how do you say when Judaism says? We're talking about a tradition that spans thousands and thousands of years. You mean Rabbi Yishmael Omer, or you say Rabbi Akiva Omer, but Judaism says? And often I feel like sometimes there's a hesitancy to respond as directly to people's questions, because because we're dealing with such an ancient and sacred and diverse tradition. But in the same way that Chazal say, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, it's not upon us to complete the task, but nor are we free to desist from it either. It's a bit of a cop-out. You can't not offer a response. It doesn't have to be an answer, but let it be a response at the very least. And so that's the ethos of this book, that often people are too shy to ask some of the more basic questions around Judaism, but it does it in a playful way and tone. And I try as much as I can in the book to bring in footnotes and things of the like, so that while there's succinct and playful answers, there's also each question has a "Jew say what" quote, like where we reference different ideas from Chazal and teachers throughout the tradition, and a fun fact. So I try to bring in as much as I can into a succinct, idle type of an answer.
Cool. It sounds really brilliant, and I look forward to reading it and sharing it with people in my community as well. Definitely think it's something that sounds really valuable. Tell me about the questions. What was one of the favorite questions that you put into that book and thought, this is something that people don't know and need to know, but isn't often addressed? Kind of one of the underdogs of the questions, perhaps.
Oof. That's such a good question. It reminds me when Reb Shlomo was asked, what his favorite song was. He would say whichever one he's singing, or whichever favorite holiday was, whatever holiday he was celebrating. There's such a wonderful array of questions in this book for me. I feel close to the question around who, I forget how it's formulated exactly, but it's who, what, why, where, how, God. Um, and the book is split up into 5 sections of grub, God, props, people, and so has different questions around each of those areas. But this question that deals with God tries to get at an understanding of what God is, who God is, if God is in the Jewish in the Jewish tradition and way. And we shy away from trying to answer things like why bad things happen to good people. I often feel if someone's trying to answer that question, you should run in the opposite direction because they're trying to sell you something. But one of the stories that I reference in the book is one that Elie Wiesel shares actually about his experience in time in Auschwitz, which was he recalls being in a bunker and God being put on trial and for the crimes against humanity, basically. And God is found guilty, and the trial ends, and then he says, okay, it's time to daven Ma'ariv now. And I love that, right? It's time to pray the evening service. I love that because it just captures the Jewish ethos to me in such a fierce way of the audacity of questions. We need to look past Avram Avinu to get a taste of that. Hashofet kol haaretz. Avram says to God, "Will the judge of the whole earth not act justly when God is thinking about destroying Sodom and Gomorrah?" So it captures the fierceness of questions. In the same breath, it holds on to Jewish practice and Jewish life and a relationship with God. So that's a taste of a question that's dear to me.
Wonderful. And I look forward to reading the rest of them. I've got one last question, which is cliched. However, I'd love to just hear one thought on it. I ask a lot of our speakers kind of what does this text have to say about the time that we're in right now, kind of in isolation, but also in a time where the world is descending into some sense of kind of divisiveness and siloed experiences of singular opinions. What do you think this text can say to people who are struggling with that right now?
Absolutely, it's one of the things I love about Torah, because this text, while it's coming from quite a long time ago, I feel like has a particular poignance and resonance for today. We needn't look past our Facebook feed to see the echo chambers of worlds and that we live in. But this coming Monday, for folks who are around on Facebook, I've been hosting this a series of talks called "The Rabbi and a So-and-so Walk into a Zoom Room," and I've had a priest on and a Holocaust survivor and the like. But I'm humbled to be hosting a former white supremacist on Monday afternoon. This is a man who was actually arrested and convicted and served time in prison for a plot that he had schemed to attack a local Jewish community in the South. And since his time in prison, is devoting himself to tshuva, to reconciliatory dialogue, and to learning. And I think about his own journey from such a hateful type of darkness to hope, I think about that in the context of folks with whom we disagree, right? We're usually not disagreeing with. I mean, if we're not usually not disagreeing with white supremacists or people who are at the other complete fundamentalist point of view, but it's a wonderful reminder that we believe in change, right? That we believe in in teshuvah and genuine, authentic return. But even if we're not going to go to that extreme, that people have the capacity to change, this text is an invitation to reevaluate, our monopoly, our so-called monopoly on truth, and invites us to take a step back and to see that indeed shivim panim laTorah, that there's many different ways to approach Jewish life and to approach life in general.
Thank you so much, Avram. I think that's a really beautiful message to end today on. And I really, really wish our audience a Shana Tova, where we can go into the next year with that sense of teshuvah, of return, of repentance, of looking into ourselves, but looking into others and seeing the value in their approaches and their faces. I'm really excited to kind of go into the year with that message going forward. I'd like to let everyone know that It Says What is taking a short break for the High Holy Days. We'll be back on the 15th of October at a new time of Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. till 7:30. So 15th of October, 7 till 7:30, a new evening time. Watch us while you cook dinner, while you have some TV time with your family. But we're looking forward to having you back with a new range of different speakers from across the world, bringing you surprising texts. And if you haven't come to our building yet, come along, take a visit and say hello to us all. We're really excited to have you physically and also virtually. Thank you again, Avram Mlotek. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Pleasure.